I once had the honor of being the Undersecretary of Education, and I remember when I came here as the Undersecretary of Education, James, I was introduced, it was in the heyday of some regulating work that we did with, not with for-profit institutions, Corinthian, ITT, we'd sort of put them, never heard of them, yeah, put them along their path, and the stock market responded the way the stock market always does, which is inaccurately and well out of the range of logic. But I was introduced as the guy who cost the audience $2 billion. So James, how does it feel?
Well, I've gotten some unfriendly receptions in certain rooms too. But you know, I think for those of us in the administration, we're pretty focused on what the president's goal is. We see higher education as a really critical path to upward mobility, to driving economic growth, to providing the skills that we need to drive the economies of the future. And the president talked about that in the State of the Union. And the question for us is, how do we live up to higher education's potential for upward mobility, for equity, given the challenges we have where low-income students and students of color often go to underfunded institutions where they're unlikely to graduate, where student debt is at high levels and is holding back young people in starting their lives. And so we're looking at how do we build inclusive institutions, how do we tackle student debt, and how do we try and really unleash the potential of all kinds of education after high school.
Let me ask a question that may seem odd to the audience, but because you and I have done this work for so long, this is a group of people who sort of take as a religious faith disruption, move quickly, regulation is always bad. The Obama administration and now the Biden administration have really aggressive regulatory regimes. What do you want from this crowd in terms of how can this crowd help make sure that regulation is targeted and meets the aims that you just articulated?
Well, let me just step back for a second and talk a little more about student debt. And we have a special responsibility where we run the student loan programs. We have seen student debt is not like it was 10 or 20 years ago. We have more students borrowing, they're borrowing more. And even when the system works the way it's intended, we have young people starting their lives. They're less likely to buy a home. They delay family formation. They delay retirement savings. So it's an overhang on the whole economy for this generation. And then you have 1 in 3 borrowers who don't graduate. You have people who get a low quality degree or don't get what they're hoping for. And that has motivated the president's plan to forgive up to $20,000 in student debt now before the Supreme Court. We have found 2 million people eligible for loan forgiveness because they're in public service, they were cheated by a for-profit college, they have a disability. And we're writing now the most affordable repayment plan that has ever existed. It's much more affordable, especially for low and middle income borrowers. So you have a really ambitious agenda to clean up the student debt problem. And then the question is, having done that, how do you make sure that all of this unaffordable debt doesn't come back? So that's the next question.
So then if I think about this group and I think about what one can do from outside the system, it's lower cost, help institutions provide surer pathways through the institution into employment. Am I right so far? Mm-hmm. So those are all things that we can be doing to help forward that agenda. And I think one of the things that's confusing to people in the room is if for-profit institutions partner with institutions to do just those things, it seems like they have now been labeled as third-party servicers, and there's a bunch of regulatory load on them for doing that. Which would, you know, if I'm an entrepreneur doing this, it's, gosh, I'm really trying to support the agenda, and why does it feel like that's not the case?
Well, I think there's an important role for for-profit companies in higher education. And if you look historically, for-profit colleges found some ways to serve adult learners in ways that other institutions were learning from. A lot of the predictive analytics work that we saw at Georgia State and other places was driven by for-profit expertise. We see retention models. And going forward with AI, I guess that's the center of the bingo card this week, and Meta and the rest of it, there's going to need to be a continued robust role for the private sector. And we recognize the value that private companies have in scale and access to private capital. There are advantages there that private companies bring to the table. So the question we have is, how do we try to make sure that we get the most out of those partnerships? And we have seen some evidence in some cases that companies whose business model is underwritten by student debt, and there are questions about the value that they're providing. There's questions about whether students are getting what they expect out of those programs. And so we're trying to learn more about those industries and trying to get more transparency into how those business models work, who is actually serving students, because we have a responsibility of making sure that when student loans are involved, that those programs are accountable to students and they're accountable to taxpayers.
So it sounds like the important factor in the equation is results at an affordable cost.
Yeah, well, again, like we're looking at a system now where, with good intentions, we've left a generation deep in debt. And for some people like me, those loans made possible an education they otherwise couldn't have afforded. And for me, I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to borrow federal loans, but that's not the experience everyone has. And we saw, prior to the student loan pause, we saw 1 million people a year defaulting on their student loans. These are low-income students, students of color, first-generation students. And that has really devastating effects for their lives if you're going to default on a federal student loan. So we need to make sure that when we talk about the great potential of higher education, that we're reliably delivering on that promise. And Ted, I saw you talking in the Wall Street Journal. There was a poll that came out that said most Americans no longer believe a four-year college is a good bet. And that's interesting terminology, a good bet.
Right.
And
not even an investment, right? A bet.
Not an investment, not a good choice. Is it a bet? And and you said you thought that was a wake-up call. So I wonder, like, what are you thinking about when does that number resonate with you? Does it surprise you? And in what ways do you think it's a wake-up call?
Yeah, I mean, so it doesn't surprise me. It saddens me a lot. But I do think that when we in the higher ed industry look at things like that, the first thing we have to do is be honest about the places in which we're underserving. I mean, those numbers don't come out of the sky. There is enough truth in the negative narrative about higher education to give us pause. And so I think each one of these surveys is a wake-up call. So, on its face, if 40% of the students who come to us for a degree, 100% of them actually want the degree, but 40% of them don't get it, is that a good starting point? I don't think so. You talk about student debt. Is the default rate a good thing for higher education? No. Are the ways we're continuing to channel students of color into certain programs that underperform? No. Those are all things. That's what I meant by the wake-up call, James, is that we need to do our part too. And so for the sector to stand back and say, well, I did say we need to tell better stories. We do achieve a lot. Right? The unemployment rate of a bachelor's degree candidate is something that we could aspire to if we were in a different world. 96% is a pretty good number, the employment rate. But we need to tell those stories better, but we also need to provide answers, which is why I think that there's a partnership that's possible between higher education and the department on some of these. Some of what you're doing, so we're, the OPM issue and the third-party servicer is the issue du jour, but when one looks with a historical context, I'm looking at Amy McIntosh, there are a lot of things that we worked on in the Obama administration that are coming back, right? So, for example, gainful employment, right? Another way to put guardrails on the underperformance of institutions. Is that a fair way to look at what you're thinking about as guardrails?
Yeah, so, if you look at where is all this unaffordable debt coming from? Disproportionate shares coming out of for-profit colleges, whether you look at default rates or debt-to-earnings ratios or repayment rates. And our experience with the gainful employment rule in the Obama administration, you were part of, Ted, was that it motivated improvements in the sector, that there are ways to deliver better value for students, and we saw colleges shortening programs, increasing scholarships, free trial periods, and that's the goal. Now, in some cases,
Harvard entered their theater management program, if I remember correctly.
which is a good example, right? Now, there may be examples of programs that close, and what we saw is students finding better choices, that there are better alternatives out there. But what we don't want to do is look the other way when we see programs that are leaving most of their graduates with debts they can't afford to repay. And that's particularly true when it's a career program that's intended to produce economic returns for students, and when the premise of the student loan program is that it's producing economic returns that will allow you to repay that loan.
So if we think about this as moving the big rocks, and student debt being the pile of rocks, one of the big rocks is for-profit institutions. Another big rock is institutions that are covered under the gainful apparatus that aim directly at creating careers that support student debt. What are the other big rocks? I have an idea of one, which is underperforming master's degrees.
Yeah, so that is another area when you look at what the sources of unaffordable debt. We do have some concerns at the graduate and professional level. Students can borrow up to the full cost of room and board, tuition and fees in graduate programs, which isn't true for undergraduates. A lot of those programs seem to be intended to produce career opportunities. So you sort of hear about arts programs or religious studies programs. That doesn't seem to be where most of the problem is. And I think we need to have an honest conversation about how we finance those programs, and are loans the right way for students to pay for those programs if they aren't producing the economic returns that would make those loans affordable.
So if you look down the list of high debt graduate programs, some of them are offered they're all offered by accredited institutions, many of them household brands, and some of them are offered in partnership with OPMs, and some of them aren't.
Yep.
Do you have a particular worry about the OPM?
Well, the OPM situation is a little different. I think it's clear that online education is a central part of higher education going forward, and that includes entirely online programs, it includes blended programs, it includes a lot of choices for students. And colleges and universities need to have ways to access the expertise necessary to build high-quality online programs and continue to improve them. And I think there's a lot of potential for online to be truly excellent in the quality that they offer students. I think in the case of OPM specifically, we've heard concerns about incentivizing overly aggressive recruiting, inaccurate recruiting, very expensive advertising practices, and sometimes students not getting what they expected or what they thought they were paying for. So that's why we're listening to the community. I think it's something we want to learn more about and figure out what's happening in this market. How do we make sure that we're serving students well? But again, we're talking about businesses in many cases that have their profits fueled on the backs of debts that students are taking out. So we have a responsibility to make sure that they are delivering that value to students.
Yep. Well, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us. We're not ending, by the way, but I want to thank James might want us to. I want to thank you for taking the pause and taking the step back, because I think I know it's been very important to the higher ed community at large, to my members, to entrepreneurs and others, to be able to come back a half a step and say, okay, there may be some problems here. Yeah. Let's find them. Let's find out if there are characteristics of the contracts, the agreements, et cetera.
Right.
And so we really appreciate that, and especially the spirit in which you've engaged in that. And we're also just in awe of the fact that this man can now make federal policy in a blog post. I just want to let you know that we now see power right here, right now. So, thanks for doing that, James. What can we do in the spirit of transparency to start to provide the department with the information that you need?
Well, I think we're interested in learning more about this sector. I think we don't necessarily know which colleges, which programs are working with which contractors. We don't know what the outcomes are that are associated with these programs. And I think right now is what we're asking for is more information, more transparency. How do we understand what's happening in this market? I understand people feel like they have a lot to be proud of. I hope we can put that on the table and talk through what's working.
Yeah, we are coming up to the end. I know we've got a couple more conversation elements, but the thing that you keep coming back to, James, which I think is important for all of us to understand, is to think about this idea of profits funded by debt, right? And that's where the federal interest lies, is in thinking about how to temper the growth of student debt, and whether profit-making enterprises are a part of that. Any tentative conclusions?
I mean, I think we're all in this work for the same reason. We're all trying to change people's lives for the better. And if you are in a for-profit business where you're trying to line up some sustainable business model behind better service for improvement for students, that's a good thing. But I do think that we need to keep a focus on whether students are being well served by the work that we're doing, and not specific to the for-profit sector. I think across higher education, across the department, we have sometimes been a little complacent in saying a college degree is worth $1 million. And we're not looking at the variation that college students see. I mean, first of all, that's 4-year college degrees. That's not a net present value, but also there's great variation among programs. There's great variation among institutions. And I think it is sometimes surprising when you look at the data to see how well your students are faring. So I think all types of institutions have an obligation to take a look at are their students graduating? Are students getting the jobs that they were hoping for? Are they succeeding financially? Because we have a significant number of borrowers out there who feel that they have been left worse off because they borrowed to go to college. And I know that's not what any of us are trying to accomplish with our careers.
Yep. So I think in addition to the big rocks of low-performing programs and for-profit institutions, the other one that I think you just skated on is non-completion, right? And so that's the other place where not only should institutions of higher education do a better job, but where there is a market, where there is opportunity for people to be working to help institutions develop, whether it's through data or support programs or tutoring, ways to help people get across that finish line, which will, by certainly the analysis that we've all done, lower the likelihood of their program financial aid defaults.
Yeah, we've made as a country tremendous progress in college completion over the last decade. The national college completion rate is up 8 percentage points. It's still only 62%. That's not high enough, but we've shown that there are ways to help more students succeed. I think we've stepped away from the culture that a lot of students aren't college material, or if students aren't succeeding, that's on them, because we now have many more examples of ways that we can better serve students and help them succeed. And there has been an important role for-profit companies in helping colleges achieve those gains.
And you've recently proposed in the budget a completion support grant program.
That's right.
Which is, I think, an evidence that the federal government is in this game and willing to fund efforts to do that.
That's right. That's right.
Well, James, this has been a great opportunity for us to talk. I think I know that you and I have a long and good shared history on these issues. From the ACE point of view, I want to remind people that we're working together with the department in the development of a new classification system for higher education. The Carnegie classification has been with us for 50 years. We're changing that classification, and I think directly in keeping with what we've been talking about today, for the first time, we will be classifying institutions according to the social and economic mobility that they provide for their students. And so at the very highest level of aggregation, institutions will come to recognize themselves as either good, bad, or indifferent on these measures that are at the bottom.
I think that's a really important effort that you're leading there, Ted, and it's part of changing what we think about higher education, where traditionally we've put a lot of focus on a small number of institutions that are highly selective, they're highly resourced, and if we're going to achieve, we're very lucky to have those places in our country, but if we're going to achieve the growth of the middle class, if we're going to drive economic growth, we need to have many more places that are helping students succeed reliably too. And so I think the efforts that ACE is making around recognizing those places that are trying to be inclusive, to look like their communities, to meet the workforce needs of their communities, is really, really important.
My last question takes us off the topic of Dear Colleague letters and into just the general budgeting. How do you feel about the president's budget that's been proposed? What are the highlights that we can look toward?
Well, we talked about the student debt problem. We talked about some of the accountability things. The investments we're trying to make in making college more affordable for current students and future students are another really important piece of this puzzle. So the president, of course, is a believer in free community college. That is in his budget again this year. We'll see what Congress does, but in the meantime, I see a lot of progress happening across the country, in New Mexico, in Maine, in Boston, and it could be this is the kind of idea that happens at the state and local level as opposed to a single walk-off grand slam at the federal level. That's usually the way our country makes progress. President has also proposed doubling the maximum Pell Grant. We've increased it by $900 over the last 2 years, proposing another $820 increase, and has included the funds necessary in his budget outline to show how we could get to doubling the Pell Grant before he leaves office. So that's an ambitious idea, but it's not an unrealistic one. It could be done in the context of a budget that actually also reduces the deficit by $3 trillion. So it is possible if we make the right choices. There's another program in there that would be new scholarships for students at historically black colleges and other minority-serving institutions. So, the problem of student debt is one that we're taking very, very seriously. We're not looking at this as a one-time patchwork or Band-Aid. We need to be thinking about how do we put in place student loan program where people who need help repaying their loans are getting it through forgiveness or through affordable repayment plans, where we are making the investments in making college affordable for future students rather than putting debts on the back of students, a form of fiscal irresponsibility. And then how are we asking the system to take a look at outcomes? And if you're using loans, that you're reliably helping students graduate and reach their goals. And so there's really an overall vision here that the president has about how to move us toward a higher education system that is a reliable force for upward mobility and for meeting economic needs.
Great, thanks. So public service is hard. The issues that James has to deal with on a daily basis are multiple. And I can tell you that from where we sit at the American Council on Education, higher education is very, very well served by James Kvaal and his team, and I want to thank him for all of us for the work that you do every day on all of these issues and the leadership that you provide.
Thank you, Ted.
So please join me in thanking James.